Sanbonani, Dumelang, Hankensa. Yes, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I must first and foremost share my appreciation to the organizers, the visionaries, whom we also refer to as the torch bearers that brought us all together. It's such a privilege for me to be here as an advocate for the future of supply chains in tandem with the unfolding Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. I'm not traveling alone. I first and foremost am sending you very warm greetings from Sandton, Johannesburg, where our team is based and also operating across 5 countries. And I'm also not traveling alone. I would not be on this stage. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Had it not been for currently the photographer, but my wife and co-founder of Coronet Blockchain. Let's appreciate her, Shadrack Kubyane. Thank you kindly, thank you. I'm aware that there's close to 30 countries represented in this room at the moment. So a bit of housekeeping as I begin. Thank you. Thank you. So a bit of translation. 9 weeks after the launch of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, I received a call on my mobile, and the person on the other side of the line, after they exchanged courtesies, and they were quite courteous to inform me that they are calling me on behalf of the Ethiopian Prime Ministry. What they said next surprised me because I would have thought that we would either continue in English or they would switch into a bit of Amharic, but what they did, they switched into isiZulu. And the gentleman said, well, Mr. Kubyane, ubuhle bendoda zinkomo zayo. I will translate a bit, and we will now segue into our supply chain conversation. Direct translation, a man's beauty, as per the Zulu tradition, is best expressed not through his reflection in a mirror or through his looks, but through the digits that make up his cattle count. That is quite interesting when you look at the rural supply chain part of the conversation, and there's a reason why. He went on to ask me, okay, fine, even though you are not a native Zulu speaker per se, you are from the north and part of South Africa, I'm impressed that you know that part, but impress me a bit. How did that come about? And I went like, okay, having spent 14 years in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal on the coast of South Africa, this is what I told him. I said, well, it came about as a due diligence during lobola or dowry premarital discussions. And it was a bit of a due diligence on the part of the elders that wanted to really understand what type of an ecosystem they are handing over their daughter's hand in marriage into. And I went on to say, I'll do my bit. I don't have all the answers on this part, as I'm not an authority of the Zulu tradition, but it means that young man who has got an abundance of cattle within his keeping, there's no poverty in his household. And I'm thinking, is this a tricky question? Let me give it another shot. He also is in possession, very privileged to be in possession of generational wealth back then. And of course, his home, just a bit of a twist there. I was kind of like, there's a certain tradition of, milk and honey. I said it means that his home is an environment of meat, milk, and money. I must say that the gray-haired gentleman was quite impressed so far, and he said, you are quite correct. And on that note, not that what you said qualifies you, because we had already had a discussion in Ethiopia and East Africa, which is the seat of the Africa Union. We need to fly you in with your team, because it is not so with Ethiopia. We are not seeing meat, milk, and money. We are seeing quite the opposite in our supply chains that are quite lopsided and are more outward facing in terms of the delivery of value rather than internal. And that's just one of the highlights when I was so privileged to lead that delegations with my team, a first of many more that we followed into discussing this specific supply chain. Now, the number one supply chain in Ethiopia per se, historically, has been and continues to be coffee. However, we were brought in, they were jokingly calling us the SWAT team. They brought us in, flown us in as a SWAT team and said, we need to rethink these three supply chains for Ethiopia as to how they could be migrated and reshaped through blockchain as a lever for development within the context of the free trade agreement. Because the free trade, good people, is a beautiful agreement, but it will remain on the shelf and gather dust if we as solutionists within supply chain and beyond do not pick it up and begin to add wheels and add mechanisms that then evolve it beyond the shelf, beyond the talk shop, into implementation, to imagine and to rethink what we collectively call the Africa we want. Very interesting last item there, because at the time we flew into Ethiopia, it was prior to my former neighbor, Mr. Elon Musk, in the Pretoria vicinity, leading, yes, he is my former neighbor. I'm very, very privileged to have neighbors like that, indeed. Even though I was not born within suburbia in Pretoria, I was actually born, once again, to represent the South African housekeeping that's happening with transparency in mind, because that's what blockchain is about. It's more than a technology, it's a transparency tool. I was not born within Pretoria suburbia. I was born about 80 kilometers north of Pretoria. Doesn't mean anything for now until I tell you in whose proximity I was born next to. There is a certain farm that's trending right now. There is a certain farm. There is a certain farm. I was born at the very foot of the Palafala Game Reserve. That's where I was born. And it's interesting because that farm is trending around lack of transparency. And I'm here on stage being the torchbearer, not just of blockchain, but as a voice of reason that can we look at some transparency equation? Because good people, transparency matters. Whether as per the first saying, Ubutle Bendoda, the Zulu saying, whether we are discussing a certain mansion on the coastline of KZN of South Africa, or we're discussing a certain farm, or we are discussing a certain furniture conglomerate, that I won't go further into that, but transparency matters. Transparency matters. And later on the board, I'm going to put something a lot closer to home. They say it's flu season. Forget corona. They say it's flu season. And during flu season, our little ones whose immune system is still building up, they sometimes need a bit of a boost and need a bit of an aid with anti-flu meds. Trust matters when your little one looks up to you. Out of that innate trust, they need to trust that what you are putting into their mouth, you have bulletproof assurance that it won't turn out to poison them. It will actually bring about the anti-flu qualities that you're putting into their body. But how can we know if, as solutionists in supply chains, we don't perform surgery on these pharmaceutical supply chains and insist, not just as experts, but as consumers of these products, to ensure that trust remains the very bedrock of especially Africa's supply chains. Before I transition into the next slide, Africa has been winning championships in all the wrong places, you know? Your corruption index, we tend to top it. Trust matters. And we don't have trust without transparency. So it might feel a bit like taking a certain supply chain or its leaders to the dentist. It might feel a bit awkward, it might feel a bit invasive at times, but to shape the Africa we want, we are going to have to think differently. Hence, when we cracked open the supply chain, the title holder on the third item, the wealthiest leather goods trader at the time was of French origin, Mr. Bernard Arnault, who is the leader of this family empire called the LVMH, the Louis Vuitton Group, with its other family of companies, including Dior. And nothing against that. We need to prosper in whatever domains we find ourselves. But when Ethiopia finds itself as a cattle capital on the continent of Africa with equally as much cattle as human beings in South Africa, 57 million to 60 million cattle. That's why the gentleman on the other side of the line said, it is not so. We are seeing the cattle, but not the value. We are on the very back footing. And with that being said, we've also been quite busy in terms of our blockchain mandate and carrying the torch of transparency. This coming July, we will be publishing thought leadership that is in line with the closed door sittings that we are having with the East Africa community of leaders on the private and public sector in terms of rethinking their tax regimes and rethinking their revenue collection in a manner that it is transparent, it is efficient, and it is sensitive to the stakeholders that these frameworks are built to serve. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, today, I'm not going to be discussing cattle or East Africa per se. I will be challenging us to rethink how evolving Africa's supply chains into the blockchain, not as a silver bullet, but as an additional mechanism for transparency. 450 billion reasons, I won't be able to cover them in the next 40 minutes. But I will single out just 3 supply chains that are going to make the subject practical, away from the hypothesis, very practical. That's what we need, practical implementations. I will be spending a bit more time on the one supply chain that is quite close to home with the tensions in Europe with Ukraine and Russia. Having these seismic activities, it has really cast a ripple effect across Africa as to can we really, really continue to be on a back footing when it comes to our food security. So as you have imagined, I'm going to be spending a bit more time on the agricultural end of the 3 supply chains, a bit of how I got here, a bit of a spotlight on the blockchain, not too much technical details, but I will actually put up a QR code in order to enable you the opportunity to scan and get a more detailed white paper on the subject. And I'm going to also single out those 3 supply chains, but most importantly, as experts within the supply chain domain, I will always be asking towards the end, what is it to you? What is it to me? And with that being said, I've already touched on that farm, so I'm going to evolve past that first item. I remain a villager at heart, and I'm very grateful for that because Africa's marketplace domain is very complex. I'm going to touch on this, the architect and the gardener. The architect and the gardener. You know, the architect profession requires an obsession over every detail, the weight, the structural integrity, the height, the depth. I mean, the type of soil. Are we speaking Cape Town type of soil, or is it the Berea red soil in Durban? What are we talking? Is it more rocky? So the architect profession, which you'll see where it's going in a moment, is a contrast from the gardening profession. Because on the gardening, you surrender a seed into the ground, and you have to master all the resilience you can master to go to bed, whether that seed, whatever happens to that seed, whether it will actually grow to start with, and the direction it will grow. Maybe it's a wine farm that you are starting, a wine startup that's going to use methodologies of the future. I don't know, but there is such a relinquishing of control on the gardening side. But on the architect side of the profession, there is I've got to really control every moving part from a town planning perspective, regulation, and the client's expectation, be it an industrial structure or a home. So why I'm mentioning that, my villager roots have helped me today, that as much as I'm privileged to fly at those altitudes where we get to, my team and I, solution governments, solution private sector entities, multinationals, including startups. Solutioning across, I always keep my boots on the ground because of my villager roots. When you are a hunter from the age of 5 years old due to poverty or necessity, when you are hunting from 5, I'm not sure what most of you guys were at age of 5, but at 5, during the lean season, because I lived off the ground, so our supply chains were very open. I knew where the food came from, not because I had a technological gadgets to scan the QR code. No, I planted that food, I cultivated. I was also kind of like removing the weeds, and I was also part of the harvest team, and I also used the pick, the digging tool. Detach it from the metal and use that wooden thing to beat that mealy into what later becomes pap. So I was pretty much in control. But then I come to the big city, Johannesburg, and I realize that I don't know 99% of stuff that is in my fridge where it comes from. And maybe I shouldn't know, maybe I ought to know. So that village at heart kind of like helps me to be bilingual, to speak both the formal and the informal economy languages. And of course, I've served time in corporate. I have been very privileged to serve entities, some of them within the supply chain itself, such as Transnet. And my last corporate role was with Deloitte, at which time the Pan-African in me was born or reborn. And of course, last but not least, we did some exciting things for 10 years after I left Deloitte within bringing new products to the market. So I did a lot of things with new products, market entry, and scaling projects, and ensuring that they stick. There's a Velcro effect that's needed when you are going to do business in Africa. There's a certain humility, and of course, I was on my way here. There's a certain challenge where water is flooding a certain construction site that another supply chain entity called Amazon had hoped by now to have actually began seeing some traction there, but nature is now moving in before the Amazon team moves in. We are seeing a bit of a flooding there. So that's just a reminder. I'm not saying who's wrong, who's right, the community. There's always these seismic forces in Africa that humble us, that when you are moving in, you've got an exciting project, an exciting thesis or philosophy, and it's urgent. One has to always kind of like take a few steps back in order to move 10 steps ahead. There is a scenario where All Mutual pumped about 1.2 billion into a Kenyan schooling startup because the local economy from a school perspective was getting a bit crowded. But during that, there was no homework done on the local climate or cultural terrain, and that was a sunken cost eventually. So that's just a reminder on that. So some of the things that we did, they led to us being funded not once, but twice by IBM to say, listen, we need to borrow a bit of your 80-20 energy from market entry to co-found Coronet Blockchain, which is basically a startup that obsesses day and night about rethinking Africa's supply chains. What is blockchain? A working definition. We could be here for like 5 days, but I'm going to just touch on 3. Blockchain is a digital ledger, of course, that really specifically records events, activities, information or data, and of course, transaction. When value exchanges hands, the blockchain will be that permanent marker that is non-erasable, decentralized. One of those buzzwords that I would like to really demystify a bit, it just means really that it's a more of a sharing economy. Some of you are aware of the ride-sharing apps that are available, but sometimes with ride-sharing doesn't mean that it's the sharing economy. Sharing economy means that we share, If you are part of this permissioned ledger, and there are certain items that you seek, whether for audit, for regulation, or even on the consumer end of the spectrum, we need to share, because this is the one part where sharing is caring, according to the level of ranking or permission that you are allowed to be part of this ecosystem. Last but not least, it's immutable. This one, based on how you are building your blockchain as a firm, it can be problematic if you do not look at certain items in your design thinking. Is it a permissioned ledger or non-permissioned? All that means is it public or private? Is it one of those, like Bitcoin is one of the famous one, even though it's more on the cryptocurrency side, away from my supply chain desk. But is all the information going to be public? This is a word here, public. Or is it going to be private? If it's private, then it means it's closed to the ecosystem of who needs to know. Who needs to know this data? And of course, you get to also remember that it cannot be deleted. Then, of course, you've got to also adapt that ledger to the local data provisions or some of the regulations in place. That's a story for another delivery right there. And with that being said, I did promise to put up a QR code for those of you that would like to scan it or even take a photo of it. Then you can scan it later in due course. What I will also do, I will courteously request that my slides be circulated as well for your convenience, because blockchain is an ongoing rediscovery, so that we can, if sharing is caring, then we have to start sharing at this level so we can grow together. With that being said, if you pardon me for time, I'm going to fast forward. 450 billion reasons was, of course, derived from the high aspirations that our continental elders had in mind when they envisaged this agreement, which took just about 5 years to ratify into action, a record for any free trade zone globally. So with the 450 billion by 2035, which is not too far away, I will get my Saturday's confirmation that we count. By 2035, we should see an intercontinental value exchange exceed 450 billion. And just from a percentage perspective, before the free trade agreement went live last year in 2021, January, we were sitting with a scenario where our inter-trade was just below 15%, which was a dismal figure, considering the likes of Europe are always hovering between the 60 and 80%. We are told to love our African neighbor, but when you're not trading with thy neighbor, I'm not sure there's much love being exchanged there. And of course, this number here, we are appealing to our elders to reconsider it. By 2035, we will have a market of 2 billion Africans. So seeking to lift only 30 million of them out of poverty appears to be something that we must be heading back to the drawing boards. Perhaps if we add a digit there, then maybe we are talking. But that's a current, bold insight. And of course, last but not least, if you love thy neighbor, you will ensure smoothness across the border. So lowering the border tariffs by up to or even more than 90%. Those are the three priorities behind powering Africa trade, with more of our supply chains and infrastructure facing more inwardly rather than outwardly, because we are not just neighbors as Africans. On the West, we've got neighbors that we have a social contract with that really enables coexistence. There's an exchange of research and development, best practice, and of course value. They give us our grain, we give them other stuff, but with blockchain being embedded into this, intertrade, we seek to see some fairness. We can have scenarios where Ethiopian coffee farmers, Ugandan and Tanzanian, are realizing I'll use this as an example, 1 cent out of every coffee cup that is traded in the West or even in Africa. I mean, coffee these days, depending on where you are at, you can look at about $4, $8, but without fail, only 1 cent goes back in that reverse mechanism back to the farm of just 1 cent. So when we see things like that, those inequalities that are built into the trade mechanism itself, then we have to rethink some of the supply chains. And of course, if you would like to snap, the full agreement is behind this QR code. There we go. I'm going to also proceed in a moment. When an architect looks at a plot, a gardener looks at a plot, they see different domains of possibility. That's why these agreements, we must read them, we must scrutinize them, because Africa is not going to be reshaped by our political elders alone. They can help us on the policy side, but the solutionists that are going to carry the new emerging Africa are right here in front of me, because you rethink the supply chain, then you rethink value. You rethink value, then those inequalities that were built into the legacy supply chains will begin to shift in that regard. If you permit me to move forward, in the best interest of time. So 3 supply chains that I will single out today. One is manufacturing, and the second one is trade itself. And the last but not least that I'll spend a bit more time on is agriculture. Manufacturing is interesting. Back in the 70s, a study was done, and it was discovered that the Made in Africa brand, from an industrial perspective, or our manufacturing output, was sitting at a not so impressive 3% of what's manufactured globally. So we are consuming a lot more than we're producing. So the Africa we want is a prosumer Africa. What that means is we are producing almost as equally as we consume. It can be swinging to the other extreme. So today, maybe you're wondering where it's sitting at. It's not above 3%, it's sitting at 1.9%. We are only producing 1.9% of goods on the continent. And yes, there are some practical reasons why some of those frictions, the Africa Development Bank is working to build some infrastructure, basic roads infrastructure. You know, blockchain is that added layer that finds other layers in place and perhaps even leapfrogs the absence of such layers. Because why I started with my farm being born in that village is that trust is trust. The moment value leaves this side of the desk to that side of the desk, there has to be trust between. You cannot now be relying on mechanism. I'll give you a scenario. If you're bringing a container in from China into East Africa, it often turns out to be a lot cheaper to move it across those waters. But the minute it hits the Kenyan port and it starts to work its way into Uganda, into Rwanda, it starts to be a lot more expensive. And part of those is because of the redundancies, the bureaucracy, and the lack of trust. So Africa was left broken on purpose for some reason. But now we are here. I'm in the presence of solutionists that are constantly seeking from their domain of expertise in co-creating the Africa we want. And of course, trade, I've touched on that. Agriculture, just think food insecurity. With that being said. So with manufacturing, the opportunity is that we currently have a domestic market on the continent of about a very decent 3.4 trillion USD. And in that regard, not only the made in SA, but each country has to now rethink its own position on the spectrum as to where they want to be, where we want to be. We can't have the scenario. I do know that market entries into Africa, even with blockchain being on the side for a moment, have proven a bit challenging, perhaps culturally, perhaps integrating what worked in SA, just integrating into Namibia, integrating into Nigeria. We've had the ShopRite group rethink their position in Nigeria, partly due to the currency emotions. The Naira was a bit emotional for quite a while, but that was before the future of digital currencies began coming into the neighborhood. Woolworths did the same, and of course, Mr. Price as well. But now that the post-COVID future-proofing of our economies is happening, we are seeing a bit of a more digitized approach to rethink heading back into Africa, because the likes of MTN has really done quite decently. I think at the last count, they had within Africa and, of course, other territories like Mexico were boasting about 230 million customers. So there is value to be realized in emerging markets if one does their homework. And of course, some gaps that exist is that Africa is a bit fragmented in more ways than one. So those market fragmentations require those blockchain inputs to consolidate the moving parts. That's where I am for the architect. One has to consolidate every moving part. You can't leave it to the Gartner mindset to say, I don't know what it's going to be. It's going to grow. No. Not when it comes to sinking value into the ground. That's where we have to see how both the data, the insights, and the other moving parts within, not the entire market, but at least the node in which you're going to deliver value between the two polars. And that now leads to the rethinking your positioning. In the middle there, South Africa still sees an influx of high counterfeits. And of course, it's a problem that's been with us. You hear that, most of us here, we drive vehicles. You hear that maybe the parts that are in your car may not be genuine parts, but you go like, but I got them from BMW, or I got them from Mercedes, or I got them from whichever manufacturer whichever dealership you're with. But then when we don't have that bulletproof assurance, why? Partly due to the silos. I'll use BMW as an example, which is just our neighbor here. Before COVID, BMW had a scenario of running a global supply chain made up of 12,000 suppliers across, I think, 57 countries, if I'm not mistaken. So that whole musical chairs of having to ensure, and somewhere in there, just to throw a spanner in the works, there's a scenario of the microchips that started happening. So you now have those gaps or those blind spots that necessitate that the silos without compromising quality assurance, the silos be nudged into shape so that we are, interesting enough, this one, because the English phrase has, has predated blockchain. We are singing from the same hymn book. But if you've got 12,000 hymn books, you may find that it's hard to stick to the same song in that regard. So with that being said, the domestic market requires that we head back to the drawing board. We don't quit. And coming through that, isn't it interesting how the majority of market insights and data about Africa are sitting outside of Africa? We need to relook at that. And with blockchain giving us the digital dust wherever it goes in a positive way, it helps us to rethink and reconsolidate what we know about this market so that you don't find ourselves having to call the West all the time. When we want to make a significant investment into a certain market, we have to call the West. You are sitting with 20 years of data. No, we need to rethink that. We can love our neighbors, but we also need to recapitalize on some IPs if we're going to win in certain markets. And of course, that real-time component of blockchain is also helpful for the R&D. It's also helpful for the efficiencies that we have been awaiting and co-creating as experts in this domain. And with that being said, on the trade side, by 2030, that 3.4 trillion would have actually evolved to 6.7 trillion, a sizable market that entities of the future have to rethink their positioning of the value to derive, but also the value to add to this growing domestic market. And access to markets still remains a bit of a challenge. You'll see on the agricultural slides. It remains a challenge for the small to medium entities because there can be a bit of sunken cost to put in there before you realize value. So supply chain digitization in this regard has become non-negotiable because if you were to look at markets like China and the US, where Amazon, as it takes off, or Alibaba, as it takes off, or even this other e-commerce giants, when they take off, they lift as they rise. They lift as they rise. So sometimes our attention can be on the giant, on the giant conglomerate. But if you look at the value ecosystem or the value core created for those entities that could not actually trade with other markets. So digitization, where we think about the lift as you rise, is a must. And of course, coming on that end, the e-commerce marketplaces of the future are going to have to be more inclusive rather than be tailored for one company. We're going to have to be more regional in our thinking, and we're going to have to be more inclusive and ecosystem where 1% of corporates on African soil can also coexist peacefully with the 99% aspirant entities. Trust, as I've touched on before, remains a key deficit that we have to address. Whether it's counterfeit drugs, counterfeit automotive parts, we have to relook at plugging the holes. And blockchain would not be doing this alone. Blockchain, funny enough, is one of those frontier solutions that do not play by themselves. It's a team sport. Not only does it require AI inputs, artificial intelligence, and others at times, but it requires a stakeholder mapping that's quite accurate, and is representative of the voices and the faces in the room. So in that regard, provenance, the origin of items from the raw material through the production lines, without the silos that are creating blind spots. Because this data exists. Everyone knows everything about how this particular humble pencil got here. And of course, it gets more complex when it becomes a mechanical device. It gets more complex when it's your iPhone and it's made up of 1,000 parts at least. Now you want to know, was there a child in DRC who had to be harmed in the process of cobalt being mined out, of making some of these parts? We may never know, because, Apple itself has got this, 12 to 16,000 suppliers, but that's a story for another day. So, but we want to know, whether from a consumer domain or from a solutionist domain. And with that being said, the direct to market, South Africa, depending on who you ask, is home to about 3,000 to 4,000 malls. Some people want to disregard the shopping complexes. Others want to include them next to the giants like your canal. But if you were to look at where the future is going with the experience economy, where I don't have to be there to experience it. I don't have to be there to buy it. And of course, somebody joked in my team that COVID, if we were to put on the side its negative ramifications, appears to have brought forward 2030 into 2020. So the hyper-digitization now sees people thinking, if I have to open a pencil selling or stationery shop and set up shop in Canal Walk here across the road, what type of due diligence? What are the fees? How much am I going to pay per square meter? Compared to tapping into the other parallel malls, 650 million, that's the total number of phones that are in African citizens' palms at the moment. With the unfolding digitization, with the unfolding capabilities that are being explored, half of those, of course, are smartphones. The others are still catching up. Before you know it, 90% of phone penetration in Africa is actually on the smartphone side. So the particularly youthful market is finding that side of the market very appealing and worthy to be explored. And they are insisting not just on experiences that are authentic, but on obsess about us as the consumer. So now supply chains of the future are going to have to tweak and rethink their existence around those what might appear to be unreasonable consumer expectations. Like, I wanted like yesterday, like, what are you talking about? But those expectations are there. Let's now co-create this. On the agricultural side, I did say I'll spend a bit more time before I wrap up in a moment. I'll start on the macro level domain. That's our bill at the moment. Our food import bill currently is approaching 100 billion US dollars. A bit bizarre if you were to look at some of these items that I have within the slides. This actually caused the outcry of the head of state in Rwanda, President Kagame, who recently set aside as a decent start, 1 billion US dollars to ensure that Rwanda itself in East Africa can be an icon among the countries that is food secure by 2025. Would that be an attainable milestone? The verdict is out. But he's just so shocked. If you're to look at, the domestic market that I touched on will be approaching 7 trillion by 2035. On the productivity side, Africa is home to at least 40 million farmers. About 6 million of them are on the formal economy side or are more commercial size, whereas the balance, the 34 million, are more, I prefer to call them hand-to-mouth, but they are more smallholder farms, on farms that are sometimes not actually, cannot be collateral. They don't own the title deeds to that farm. They experience a post-harvest loss of up to 50 or 60% due to some of the quality assurance mechanisms they don't have, they cannot meet. So how do you have 65% arable land globally as a resource or an asset that is untapped as a continent? When you contrast it with Netherlands that has actually powered their farming ecosystems, despite the body of water, despite the challenges that they had to pull off these efficiencies across their agri-value chains. We also have the youngest workforce currently. I think we're approaching about 500 million young people between 18 and 35. That's an untapped skill, but it's also an untrained skill. What are they being trained for? Administration. They are trained for this. They are trained for that. But what if they were to be digitally ready? What if they were to be trained to actually start here with a mindset to see agriculture being attractive again, because we are all consuming, but who's producing? And now there's all these tensions that we have to reconsider to tap into that, the talent capital and the land asset itself. If you come on this side, I've touched on the high import bill that's being brought down by some mechanisms. South Africa itself, I think about 3 months ago, launched an audit, an anti-competition audit, in terms of seeing whether the giants in the farming equation are playing nicely with the little guy. So the verdict is out on that one as to some of the anti-competitive elements that have found their way into preventing market access. It's interesting on that particular note because I'll show you the other investigation that was done by Walmart in less than 3 seconds. And of course, the dependencies on our neighbors from far out, like your Russia and Ukraine, has worked until now, but now I'm making an appeal to my fellow expert, and solution is to say, let's go back to the drawing boards. When we go home here, when we go back to our firms, let's revisit the drawing boards to see if there are some legacy methodologies that we have to reconsider, because some dependencies are becoming a bit outdated if you are in that domain. And of course, with that being said, I've touched a bit on that. So in terms of food poisoning or foodborne diseases, food poisoning, we have a scenario where Africa is home to about 91 million infections that are recorded. And of course, those are the deaths that we experienced this past year, 137,000. In South Africa particularly, some of you may recall the case of listeriosis, which is still out in the open courts at the moment. So my hands are a bit tied in terms of commenting further on that one. But when you lose 200 lives, and it's actually not some smallholder farmer or small producer or small manufacturer who was testing out some things that went wrong, but it's actually a giant among us that we respect, that we hope will actually bear the torch of excellence, then without pointing fingers as to who's wrong, who's right, but I'm hoping that the verdict will be a lesson for all of us as to heading back to the drawing board, working in those transparencies that I emphasized at the beginning of the discussion. 2.5 seconds is how long one of our strategic partners through IBM into Walmart actually invited us into a litmus test of how long blockchain can actually take in order to bring about provenance, to determine a food item on the shelf. You pick it up, and if it's part of a blockchain node, when you scan it, 2.5 seconds, it can tell you which farm, what went into it, what fertilizer, what pesticides, everything, all in 2.5 seconds, particularly if you're part of that permission ledger. So to have an investigation to find out why listeriosis killed 200, taking about 6 months, taking about 12 months, with the case dragging even closer to, if not beyond, the 5-year mark. It's quite a sad scenario when you consider the cost that's paid up there. The 34 million farmers, if I was to be their voice for a little bit, the 34 million informal sector farmers are hoping that in our busy activities, we will spare a thought for them and reconsider how, whether as a force for social good or as something we do for profit, there's nothing wrong with either, that we will find a way to rethink and reshape our supply chains to be a bit more inclusive to them, because if you think about a granny who is the third or fourth generation working that farm, working that piece of land, it's part of the pride of who they are as a family. But over a period of time, what they take home has just been dropping. And out of the close to 1 billion people that go hungry every day across the world, I think it's sitting about 700 million. I'm sad to say that some of them, or a majority part of them, are actually farmers, particularly during lean season. Now, just like a scenario of a thin chef might come across more on the funny side of things, but a scenario of a hungry farmer, it becomes very, very scary to think about. Let's see how we can give them market access as we deploy our superpowers and our, our certified black belt expertise within and even beyond blockchain. And last but not least, I've already touched on this one. It's a worthy mention. I won't go much into it, but our pharmaceutical value chains, in certain countries, it's even more than 42% chances, 42%. It's like a Russian roulette. Like, honey, I'm not sure whether I'm giving you the good bit or the bad bit. This medication might kill you, but I'm not going to freak out my baby. I'm just going to put a brave face and just hope for the best. Just cross my fingers. When it's close to home like that, it's no longer a supply chain matter. It's family. It's family. So let's really rethink our positions on these things and going right along for the benefit of time. And on the microdynamics, there is some tested out protocols that we are busy with at the moment where blockchain is geared to be deployed to cause, I'm going to borrow a bit on a local dynamic, Masholisane. There is a stokvel culture that happens. Stokvel is a collective borrowing or sharing of resources or even saving money together. So we are seeing how emerging technology can bring about into the farming value chains what's being practiced already culturally to ensure the sharing economy around tokenizing equipment on the lower tier end of farming, so that that tractor can show up when it needs to show up, where it must show up. With that open book kind of sharing. There's no, you kept it for 3 days longer on your farm. No, that tractor has to really be out there. Even when it comes to the engineering inputs or servicing of the tractor, it must be serviced when it needs to be serviced. Because the beautiful part about the blockchain, you won't have to fly from Cape Town to Uppington or Kakamas or those far away regions to go investigate as to why was this tractor broken down. You won't need to. You just have to look at the ledger and have a look at who was supposed to fix it. It's all there on the ledger. And if they fix it, what parts did they put in there? So all these tensions that may not affect us in this room, but they hit hard those 34 million farmers. We have to rethink them with supply chain rethink and, of course, blockchain transparencies with also decentralizing knowledge access. When it comes to co-ops, there's already a culture of bonding together where farmers, they seek to go to market together. They may be losing 50% of their crops, but they just huddle together. It's almost like a war psychology scenario where we face the elements together, we stick close, but we are also praying that one day some rethink of this value chains that are hostile towards us from the farming base will actually see the lowering of the barriers to entry without the lowering or the compromise of quality assurance. That's not negotiable, because we are experts on the one hand that help you to lower the barriers so you can enter the market without touching or compromising quality assurance, but we're also going to end up as the consumers of your product. So we have a responsibility on the business to consumer end. And with that being said, we have scenarios where families have been farming land for 5 generations, but they still don't own title deeds. There was an initiative recently here in Cape Town that was carried out by a certain family that went around giving, not just on the farming side, but the title deeds of homes that people have been living in, but they don't own them. So we seek to see more of those initiatives being fast-tracked with the Deeds Registry Office for the means of production, which is the farming side of things. They farm the land, but they cannot make any claim to it. They can't use it as a collateral. They can't take it to the bank. When that's the scenario there, then of course they have nothing to really use as float or to carry those tough seasons on their books. So we need to look at that. Those are some of the things that my team is testing out on behalf of regions and also a bit inwardly there. For the benefit of time, I'm going to race towards the second last. And we talk about inclusion, right? We talk about inclusion. I think, our Saturday counter, we are about somewhere in the region of 390 Saturdays when the Sustainable Development Goals are going to expire. We started with the Millennial Development Goals. Now we are on the Sustainable Development Goals. And most of these farming communities, producer communities, small businesses, they don't know much about how $4 to $8 trillion is spent to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals. They don't know much about those figures. Those figures are flying over their heads. They're just hoping that they will somehow be included in this economies. And blockchain as an enabler of those supplier development programs that we already have in place. JSE, Johannesburg Securities Exchange, those companies there, every year, about 350 of them, they set aside about 50 billion local currency, 50 billion rands towards either skills or supply development. So they are doing it. You know what the challenge is? There's so much of redundancy. There's so much of duplicate expenses, duplicate costs. The left hand is definitely not talking to the right hand. So when we kind of like lessen those silos there so that there's no duplicate applications, there's no duplicate expenses on the books, that's where we can see the Africa we want. Not only should a farmer, I'm using farmers as an example, there's a whole lot of other production domains that exist. For the benefit of time, I had to single out these ones, but the farmer or the candidate on that supplier development, I think Vodacom has got a supply development bill of about 45 billion rands currently, just Vodacom on their procurement in equipping what they refer to as the little guy or the SME. But how are those expenses spent, you see? Maybe it's none of our business for now, but when 5 years later, 10 years later, the developed or emerged Africa is not emerging, isn't it costly how a letter D is? Let me put D here. Isn't it costly how a letter D can be? We have been speaking about emerging economies, emerging countries. When are we going to add the letter D? When are we going to move from emerging to emerged? It's going to require more than political will. It's going to require more than policy. While political will, policy, budgetary resources, and others, it's all good. But the machinery that moves our economies rises and falls within how our supply chains are set up. It's all about the exchange of value, what moves from A to B, and how it moves, you see? We need to really look at that. And of course, who gets the lion's share of the value? That's where our supply chains have to be transparent. Last but not least, we can't have an Africa, although other emerging markets might put their hands up, we can't have an Africa where for the foreseeable time, corporates or the big guys are seeking to just do that tick box exercise. We had a discussion in World Economic Forum not long ago, and what was put forward is, how does planting X number of trees in Africa, strange enough, on that emerging green belt, how does that equal complying with ESG when those two cannot be correlated on the same ledger, not 20 different ledgers, just the same ledger where A equals B on the same ledger, then maybe we can talk. So this type of transparency beyond tick box exercises relates well beyond agriculture. The message is clear. We have to head back, not just to our homes after this flagship conference that's been long awaited since 2019, since the break, but we have to head back with a fresh perspective and a renewed commitment to rethinking our inputs as equally as we rethink the value that we derived out of the supply chains that we are privileged to call home. And on towards conclusion, so the writing is on the wall, 450 billion. 450 billion. Those are more than reasons. Perhaps that figure could move to about 800 billion in about 3 years. Even in a post-COVID, future-proofing our economies, we are definitely going to rethink where our food comes from. We're going to rethink that food bill. So as those reconsiderations are taking place, we're going to have to rethink that 450 billion US dollars will not be enough in terms of exchange, but it will require strategic infrastructure investments. It will require a different mindset. And there is in my backyard, Santen, there is a tendency of, you know what? We are doing ABC in South Africa, and then this is our rest of Africa commitment. You see, that type of mindset might have worked before COVID, but I think COVID has really, really rummaged our life with some really, really grave truths and pain on so many levels. I don't remember last time I met someone who hasn't lost somebody during COVID. It's just become that ugly on a personal level. But on the other side, COVID has also become a voice of reason of, are we Africans, as in can? Are we Africans? Or we are just those SA guys, or we are just from that other country and there's the rest of Africa. So we have to really remove the silos. Before we remove the silos in our supply chains, they have to perhaps go in our cultural lenses or perspective, because when you are parachuting in solutions, those on the ground will actually see that, wait a minute, this is an SA solution. You just put a fresh coat of paint on it. This is not us. You didn't wrap it around who we are. So let's rethink our rest of Africa thinking lenses as I wrap up. Of course, blockchain may not be the magic pill, but blockchain is an enabler. You see, once you perform surgery on any specific trade node or trade corridor, it could be just two companies exchanging values. It could just be one of my friends. They actually make the speed point machines, but they don't have capacity to produce them. They are based in South Africa. They are a German firm. These are made in China, and somehow things are not balancing. When they order 100,000, there's always 10,000 missing. So now they cringe because they're wondering, where did that 10,000 speedborn machines end up in? So when your supply chains are not a singular hymn book, for lack of a better practical term, then those blind spots are going to leave room, are going to leave an open door for some really rogue elements to come in there and really cost you sleep. And today's sleep has become a lot more pricey than it was before COVID. So blockchain as an enabler just cuts through the nonsense, just brings the right stakeholders in the room to really look at the right holistic solutions, not singular, holistic. So worthy of consideration. On a parting note, I would like to put it out there that not only would my slides be circulated with the blessings of the organizers, but I will also be available amongst you as your fellow expert. I might be leading on the blockchain side of the equation, but just like how there's no rest of Africa, there's no rest of this. We are really part of the same community, and we are part of the same ecosystem. When in 2035, Africa is home to 2 billion citizens, will that be equal, double the challenges, or will it be double the opportunities? I don't have an answer for that one. That answer will have to be co-created amongst us based on what we do with all the great insights of the last 2 or 3 days that have been shared, where from different sides of the domain, we are all wanting to co-create the Africa we want. When that happens, I'm hoping that your name will be on that historical ledger where the historians will look back and say, it was you, it was you, it was you, it was your team that helped to emerge the Africa we want. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you kindly. Thank you for your time.